I'm going to move on real quick to discuss some blanket waivers. I know I got one question today, so I think these are going to be some really helpful couple of slides. The first blanket waiver, this is the same blanket waiver that was approved during the 21-22 academic year. It's the full-time enrollment blanket waiver. And what it says is for kids who have graduated prior to the 22-23 academic year, they have the ability to continue to participate, but only enroll in 6 credits. This waiver only can be used if kids did not use it last year. So that was one of the things that came up, and I owe someone an email back, but that's something to keep in mind. If it doesn't, if it's already been used, it can only be used once. This, just so you can plan out academic calendars with your kids, it will not be extended for a 3rd year. So kids will want to plan their rest of their terms and their seasons, knowing that this is the last term that the full-time enrollment blanket waiver can be used. Corey made a very helpful visual chart. If it's easier to go through the chart with kids and with their timeline. So you can see for kids that didn't use it and then those that did, you can follow the progression with your students who have graduated or those who are graduating this year. And this will be provided to everyone, so you'll be able to keep a copy as you're going through and having discussions. One thing to keep in mind is if your kids are not eligible for the blanket waiver and they cannot enroll per the normal legislative requirements, you do have the ability to file a legislative relief waiver. You can go through, you can provide the extenuating circumstances, and then our team can go through and review everything per the directives. The other blanket waiver that is passed is the graduate post-baccalaureate student waiver. So this is previously what would happen is per bylaw 1419, non-Division III students could not participate at a Division III school as a graduate student unless they got a legislative relief waiver approved. What happened with this blanket waiver is if a student meets all of the criteria of the waiver, it can be self-applied on campus and you do not have to file the waiver. This blanket waiver will remain in effect until the 2023 NCAA convention, so until January. So you'll be able to self-apply this for students who are enrolling this fall and potentially, depending on enrollment and terms and graduation, you can also go ahead and apply this for mid-year enrollees. These are the 4 criteria for meeting the waiver. I'm sure you've seen these in the directives. I'm sure you've reviewed them, but just real quick, we're looking for students who graduated with their undergraduate degree within 4 academic years. That means if a kid graduated in 3.5, they're okay because they were within 4 years. We're also making sure that a student did not have any breaks in their full-time enrollment. So during that 4-year period, they were full-time every semester or every trimester or quarter. The student has to have earned a minimum 3.0 cumulative GPA. And then finally, they also have to have a season of participation remaining per the Division III legislation. And that last piece is important because if a kid had a red shirt at a Division I or II or NAIA school, that red shirt does not necessarily follow them. You want to look at that semester or season and figure out per the Division III legislation, did they use the Division III season of participation? Now saying that, the COVID relief that was provided at previous institutions can follow. So you may have a lot more students now who are graduate students that can participate because they have an extra season left. So here's another flow chart again. I think what is important to remember, if they are coming from a Division III school, you will apply the normal 1419 legislation. You do not need a waiver. It's not something you need to self-apply on campus because it's not needed. We're talking about students who have graduated from a non-Division III school. So Division I, Division II, an international university, or an NAIA school. Within those 4 criteria, if a student is deficient any of the 4, you do have the option to still file for a legislative relief waiver. Talk with the student and figure out what the mitigation is, and then staff can review and determine whether or not there's flexibility within the guidelines. Both of these blanket waivers have question and answer guides that are up on the Division III compliance homepage. I would definitely encourage you to take a look if you've got specific scenarios. This presentation will be provided, and all of this is hyperlinked to take you directly to the compliance page. So if there aren't any questions.
Sarah, we had a question in the chat.
Okay.
It related to, if a student athlete graduated in spring 2022, would they be able to compete? They graduated from that same institution as an undergraduate. I guess they have remaining eligibility. Would they need to enroll in grad school, or can they take up to 6 credits in order to be eligible to complete if they have remaining eligibility?
So back to the full-time enrollment waiver, you can go through and you can see if they did graduate spring 22, they can use the blanket relief if they haven't already used it. They have to enroll in a minimum of 6, and if it's not in a graduate or post-baccalaureate program, it does still need to be in courses or credits that can help with professional development. So that's something, as you work with an academic advisor, get that letter on file to keep it, to show that these 6 minimum credits to allow the student to still participate are meeting the directive.
Great, thank you.
Of course. Any other questions?
Not at the moment.
Okay, perfect. I will move on to social media. I know Dan made a comment that social media isn't used as much these days in the recruiting process, or there's a different value to it. We definitely understand that, but I think it's something that is used frequently, and it's something that the students that you're talking to do use. So we're going to cover the rules for that. Within social media, we're talking specifically about athletics-based recruiting. So the legislation, whatever your admissions does and normal registrar policies are, we're not going to put limits on, we don't have the authority to put limits on their recruiting process, but for athletics-based recruiting, what we're looking for are governing institutional accounts, athletics accounts, team accounts, and that includes official and unofficial accounts. So your student run counts are unofficial team accounts. So those would still be under the bylaw limitations. Athletics department staff member personal accounts. So as you're personally tweeting from your own account, you're still held to some of these recruiting restrictions. And then also there are specific requirements if student athletes or accounts are used when it's at the direction of athletic staff, because now it's coming from an institutional account and at the direction of the institution. So those are the types of accounts that we're going to talk about in the next several slides. It's also important when we're figuring out where in social media we're looking at, we're trying to figure out who we're talking about. So you have the prospective student athletes, your prospects, your recruits. Those are the kids who have started classes for 9th grade and they're still in high school. They haven't yet started out a university anywhere. It also encompasses kids that are from a 2-year or another 4-year college. So as you're going through and within the recruiting bylaws in 13, those other college kids could still be considered prospective student athletes if they're not yet at your institution. They switch over to being a student athlete when one of 2 things happens. They attend classes at your institution as a full-time student, or they attend a regular squad practice. So for anybody whose term hasn't started but practices have, your freshmen probably have now triggered student athlete status, and they're going to be in a different area of the legislation. So first, we're going to talk about prospective student athletes, and it's important to keep in mind with communicating and recruiting with prospective student athletes, there are 3 benchmarks as you're going through and having these discussions with them. The first benchmark is the student has started 9th grade, but they haven't yet made a financial deposit to any institution. And during this first time period, you can only have private communication with the student. So that's calling them directly, it's texting them, FaceTime, email, direct messaging. It's types of communication that only the student should be able to see, or their parents. But it's not public. It's something that has to be between you and your prospects. Within this time frame, there are no restrictions on the timing or number of communications you can have with a student. So I know Dan said earlier, the better. That's definitely true, and it can definitely be used within Division III, because once they become a prospective student athlete, you can now start engaging in recruiting. There is one limit: you cannot talk with them at the site of organized competition. So important thing to keep in mind: if they're on campus for an event, a high school event, you have to make sure that they're released for the day before you can have any kind of recruiting contact. The second benchmark is after financial deposit, but before May 1st. And it's a very short period of time that this occurs, but you can make that public commitment announcement now. They've accepted, you're able to go ahead and say, Jeff Myers has been accepted or is coming to Turner University to play soccer. Now, during this time period, the communication still does have to be private. So if I make that post, I cannot tag Jeff, I cannot @ him, I cannot do anything that connects him through the social media platforms to my post. Now, he can go ahead and decide what he wants to do with that post, but it's really important that you still keep that clear-cut line between the private communication and the public, and you can't link the student to the post. The manner of the post that you want to do it, it's up to you. Fun graphic, totally fine. Again, just don't link the student to the post. And then the final benchmark, the big date, May 1st, and after a student's deposit. And after that date, you can have public communication with the student. You can tag the kid, you can link them to accounts, you can make comments. At that point, things have opened up. There is a proposal out there to change that May 1st benchmark date. So you've probably heard about that. That's something that will be voted on in January. The proposal has a January 1st date instead of May 1st. So think about, as you go through this next year, you can kind of think about how your recruiting goes and figure out, is there value in moving that date up? But for now, though, it is a May 1st date, so you're going to be limited until next spring for your seniors. Within the communication legislation, there's an exception for social media that allows an institutional account to connect with the student and then engage in actions of approval. So you can friend or follow the student, and then once you've done that, you can then like, you can retweet, you can favorite. But what is really important about that is you're not making the content. So that's where it's still considered private within the legislation. So again, the student can make a post, the student can retweet or tweet, you can retweet, you're not making the content, it's still the student's content, and still within the legislation that's considered private. I'm sure you all have heard about the tap, don't type motto. Keep just one thumb, type, or like something, favorite something, have a reaction, whatever you want. You can tap only until May 1. So here, if you need a reminder about some of the platforms, these are the ones popular today. I'm sure tomorrow we'll have something else, but that's something that is a possibility as you engage in the recruiting process with your prospective student athletes. There is a great resource on the Division III compliance homepage that y'all may want to keep a copy of. It's got the list of which accounts are included in the restrictions, and then this resource is specifically for prospective student athletes and bylaw 13. As we move over to talking about social media for student athletes, really what we're focusing on is out of season social media use. And when we're focusing out of season, the first thing that we have to talk about is voluntary activities. So voluntary athletically related activities can occur out of the season, but to be considered voluntary, they do have to meet all the parameters within the legislation. So those are listed here. You can't be required to have the student athletes report back. All the activities are initiated only by the student. Attendance cannot be recorded. So if someone doesn't show up, you shouldn't know about it. There shouldn't be a penalty for not participating. And alternatively, you can't have incentives or rewards for people who do attend some voluntary activity or participate in a voluntary activity. So with that mindset, we can now move on to talk about what can and can't happen with social media. So student athletes, for the most part, whatever they want to do on their own personal accounts in regards to voluntary athletically related activities, they have the control. We are not going to govern student athletes' accounts and what they decide or not decide to post. Where it does become important is when we go back to what accounts are governed by the rules is if student athletes are posting at the direction of athletic staff, they now fall under an institutional account and athletic recruiting, and then there are prohibitions against what can and can't occur on those posts. But if the students are doing it all by themselves, they have the ability to move forward. Similarly, if they want to post on their team accounts, unofficial or official, if they want to do social media takeovers for their voluntary athletically related activities, that cannot occur because now it's reporting back and there's an attendance record. And so that negates the voluntariness of the activity. And then finally, if they do want to post on their personal accounts and they're doing it entirely by themselves, if they want to tag someone with an institutional account, that's fine, but the institutional account cannot respond. On the other side, we've got coaches and institutional accounts. So just to kind of group them together, when it says it's not permissible, really what we're looking at is there any reporting mechanism that comes out of that action? Does it show that the attendance was being monitored in some way? And that's where for voluntary athletically related activities, that reporting and the attendance negates the voluntariness of the activity. The other two scenarios here that are permissible, I think what's really important is out of season, is the activity otherwise permissible? So summer leagues that are open to all and anybody could walk by, anybody can go through and watch, that's fine. If coach wants to go ahead and post a picture of an otherwise permissible activity, that's okay. Same with the community service project. There is an exception within the bylaws that say community service project and fundraising, provided it's been approved, can occur out of season as long as the team is engaging voluntarily, and coach can go ahead and post that picture. So have any questions come in?
Yes, I have one question. Okay. Could a coach or another staff member post a team having like a team building activity on the team's Instagram page or the team's social media? So like they're not doing anything sport related, like they're playing freeze tag somewhere outside. Is that a permissible post?
In season, yes. Out of season, no. And the reason why it wouldn't be permissible out of season is because within the legislation, what staff has said interpretively is team building falls under the perimeters of athletically related activities, so they can only occur in season. So the activity itself shouldn't be happening to start with, hopefully. But in season, if you want to post about team raising or team building opportunities, that's fine.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, I'm going to keep it going because I know I'm running off on time. I also apologize if I start talking too quickly. Fundraising was another question that came up that Kim wanted covered. It was team and individual fundraising. Part of the individual fundraising I'm going to cover in the NIL section. But for institutional and team fundraising, really what it comes down to is 3 parts. Donations for institutional and team fundraising should be made in accordance with your institution's donation policy. Any money that comes in should go to a general team fund, and unearned fundraising cannot be earmarked for a specific student athlete. So if you have a letter writing campaign, the legislation says that's unearned funds. So that has to go in the general team fund and then can be distributed with whatever the parameters are that are set for the general team fund. Fundraising out of season, so kind of connecting back to social media, you can have team fundraisers outside of the playing season. Within the legislation, it is important to remember that you have to receive approval for the activity from your institution's chancellor or president or whoever they designate before the activity occurs. So make sure you get that stamp of approval. And then if student athletes want to participate, the fundraiser out of season must be voluntary. Also, with out of season fundraising, you do have the ability to provide students actual necessary expenses in relation to that fundraiser, provided the fundraiser is also otherwise permissible. So let's say you've got a team fundraiser and you're going to do it a couple blocks away. You go ahead and say, okay, it's going to go over dinner time. We're going to provide the students with a meal. That's fine, because now the expenses are in conjunction with an otherwise permissible fundraising activity. And then similar to team building, you can go ahead and publicize or post about the activity from an institutional social media account. We're getting a lot of questions these days about crowdfunding by the institution. The guidance is still the same as the first slide when we talked about fundraising. So the fundraising needs to be under institutional control. The funds that come in need to go directly to the institution, and then from there to the team's general fund. It can't be earmarked for a specific student athlete. Some crowdfunding links can be shared, and then it becomes person-specific links. It's really important, if that's the crowdfunding service that you decide to use, that those links are not connected to student accounts and the funds do not go directly to student athletes. Crowdfunding is unearned and it's not permissible directly for student athletes. So if you want it to be institutional crowdfunding, it does need, all the funds need to go directly to the institution instead. And then within this section, just a quick plug for fundraising for individual student athletes. I know that there are always scenarios that come up. Your institution can arrange for fundraisers when there are extreme circumstances. Someone is diagnosed with cancer, if there's natural disaster, a house burns down, you can go ahead and organize that fundraiser. When you go through and you do that, the proceeds have to be designated for a specific purpose. So if a house burns down and you decide to fundraise for items in the house, that's permissible. Just make sure it goes directly for that purpose. The proceeds have to be given directly to the beneficiaries, and you want to keep all the documentation on file. So you'll want to do your due diligence if that comes out. A lot of times what happens with these events is they're started by someone else. And then the question is, can the institution participate or help? If that's the case, go ahead and take control of the fundraiser in general. And then you can know that everything's going through you and you've got the documentation and you can make sure it follows the legislation for being permissible. Any fundraising questions before I move into NIL? Okay. Just a reminder about the interim policy. So I know that y'all talked about this earlier from a conference perspective, but just a general overview. The interim policy, NIL opportunities cannot be used as recruiting inducements or a substitute for pay for play. It did go into effect July 1 of 2021, so that's important as we move to the next slide. So y'all had the conversation earlier. I think where our guidance has been coming from, we've tried to be consistent across the board with our messaging. The analysis for NIL is really twofold. The first level is, are there any state or local laws that govern the activities in question to show that those are NIL activities? if a kid has already triggered student athlete status and they've enrolled at an institution, sometimes institutional policies can come into play, and that level of analysis is the same. The second level of analysis is if you determine the activity is an NIL activity, is it occurring in the specific manner that is it permitted in the specific manner that it's being conducted? So if you go through and the legislation for your state says it's okay for students to sign a contract with Nike, but within this contract, they have to have at least 50 hours of work for X amount of dollars. If you go through and you're talking with the student and that activity is not within the legislation, then the next level of analysis occurs. And you have to look at whether or not within the NCAA legislation, the activity is okay. The other thing to keep in mind is if an agreement is signed prior to the interim policy, so again, that July 1, 2021 date, you would need to review the current NCAA legislation to see whether or not it would have been otherwise permissible. So I know that some of y'all have international kids who have international kids take a gap year. So it's possible some international recruits sign something with organizations and companies in their home country for social media influencers. If it was signed prior to July 1 of 2021, that's something you've got to keep in mind. And then you have to look through the normal legislation and figure out whether or not it would have been okay. So we cannot help with that the first two levels of analysis. You have to look at your state laws and your institutional policies. Then you have to figure out if it's being conducted in accordance in which it's okay. So that's stuff that has to happen on campus. I'm sure you can get help from your conference, but where we can come in as a NCAA staff is if the legislation has to apply instead, we can go through and help with the application of legislation. The last thing I wanted to touch base on, and this is kind of connected to fundraising, but also not, is NIL and crowdfunding for students. So crowdfunding in and of itself is not an NIL deal unless it's permitted under state and local laws or under institutional policies. I have not heard of any state or local laws that permit crowdfunding or have crowdfunding categories as an NIL deal. So looking through what y'all have, if it's not, then where we want to make sure that we're very careful is crowdfunding is not permissible for student athletes if there's any kind of relationship or connection to athletics. So if they're trying to crowdfund for money to go on a foreign tour, not okay. It's not an NIL deal because they're not doing anything to get those funds. There is an educational column that's linked to this presentation. And so when I send it to Kim, you'll be able to review that and keep that handy. I'm sure that as we continue to move forward, crowdfunding seems to be a more popular source for people. And so we can go through and make sure that everyone has the resource so that we can answer the questions. And so now in the general question slide, has anything come in specifically about NIL? Any questions about NIL?
I don't see anything in the chat right now, Sarah. Obviously, we covered quite a bit earlier.
Yeah.
Definitely appreciate the overview provided, and we'll certainly share the resources out with the group. We'll give it a couple of minutes to see if anybody has anything else.
So two came in that I'll go ahead and address. If there are still tennis coaches on the call.
Yeah, absolutely.
There was some questions raised early about scoring. So there was a call last week with ITA. They are proposing that Division III use the 7-point scoring system for just select matches. It wouldn't be for all. What their hope or what they envision is it's mainly for the ITA Indoor Championship. If a conference is interested in moving to 7-point scoring for conference matches, they are willing to have a conference pilot the scoring system If that's something you're interested in, reach out to Kim or Carl or anybody else in the conference. The conference would need to reach out to ITA, and ITA specifically would need to approve it before you can start using that scoring system. Other than that, if you want to keep the 9-point scoring system for everything else, totally fine. The other thing that came in, there's some question about minimum participants. ITA has some rules about the minimum participants to potentially win a match. It's important to keep in mind for sports sponsorship purposes, you do still need a minimum of 6 participants. So as you're going through and as you're thinking out your roster and planning for your tennis season, it's 6 for the minimum.
There is a question in the chat just going back to the crowdfunding. If a sports-specific page, a team account advertises crowdfunding, can student athletes share on their personal social media?
They can, as long as the link is still an institutional link and the link all the funds from that link go directly to the institution. It would be something that students would have to do voluntarily though.
Great, thank you.